This topic is always post-COVID, long COVID, post-virus, spike. Today it's called spikopathy. So what kind of problems do spikes cause? With the new mRNA 2.0 technology, things are getting even more dramatic. Also in cancer defense, which represents these very bad developments with what is unscientifically called turbo cancer, because of course it got to places where it shouldn't go, because there weren't 5,000, but 10 million. They're everywhere, and there we saw that these spike proteins unfortunately play a very, very central role, namely severely weakening the innate immune system. So there's no official research because it's not necessary. That's not a problem at all. We even asked the health authorities afterwards. Let's say, can you tell us anything about a dose? And funnily enough, these questions are never answered. Human viral proteins uncontrolled, and here the emphasis is on uncontrollable. That doesn't prove that the spikes are really gone. Well, you have to measure that when you measure. And these methods don't exist yet. You always have to be honest about that. These spike proteins, which are viral proteins, are not human proteins, where there are obviously possibilities that these proteins can also be exchanged or passed on via the respiratory tract, sexually, bodily fluids, or whatever. We are seeing an increasing number of cancer cases, on the one hand new, but above all previously stable and now spreading explosively. So away from the more or less lethal vaccine, which was already controversial at the time, towards this completely new technology and that applies to the whole of Europe. Did I understand that correctly? Ultimately, it is approved in Europe. There are many interesting things. Ultimately, they are proteins, and ultimately we want to get rid of the proteins. To do this, we have to bind them somehow, take them, ideally chop them up or something, and excrete them. That's kind of the idea behind all this. And three central problems are actually emerging. This video is brought to you by your Mr. Broccoli and is intended for people who want to form their own opinion outside of the mass media. There are
currently a lot of questions from our community regarding shading. What is chatting anyway? How can someone get infected, or how are spike proteins transmitted and what can trigger it? Not only in your entire body, but perhaps also in your environment. And who better to invite than our Doctor of Medicine Simon Feldhaus? By the way, he was born in Germany and now lives in Switzerland. It's also very important, you are German.
Yes. Yes. So, you've already been here 2 or 3 times on our video call, each time with great enthusiasm, and you don't just work for yourself with CAM Consulting, which we've linked below, but also in the pyramid of a more or less hospital, and there you probably also have a lot of patients with long COVID, spike, and who also ask you about chatting, right? Yes. Hello Christian, thank you very much for wanting to talk to me again. I think that's something I really enjoy doing, and yes, that's how it is. Well, in terms of parameters, it's a large outpatient clinic. So, we are a hospital, but without overnight stays. So we don't have any inpatients with overnight stays, but many patients are integrative medicine patients, and this topic of post-COVID, long COVID, post-COVID, spike, today it's so nicely called spikopathy. So what kind of problems do spikes cause, and then also the question of how do I get rid of them all? Through illness, therapeutic measures with this injection are somehow transmitted in some other way. Of course, these are very big areas in which we have to discuss with patients on a daily basis. And that's where the question of shedding, as we have to call it these days in modern German, i.e. the spreading of spikes via other channels, respiration or similar, naturally comes into play. Yes, So let's briefly go over the topic from the back. We basically had the pandemic, let's call it that, and when I got infected with corona, so-called spike proteins were formed in the body. But it's also the case that if I wanted to protect myself against it with the nonsense, as you like to call it, then these spike proteins are also formed, and it seems as if the body can't differentiate between them. And these spike proteins cause all sorts of mischief in the body. They probably also interfere very, very strongly. And what I also learned today from current research is that they even block the body's own healing systems. Keyword autophagy. That means it's actually doubly bad. They cause damage and then also prevent the body from healing itself. Is that true? Do you also see this in your practice through measurements or other things? Yes, that's actually the core of the problem. Quite trivial. It really is the core of these spike proteins, which are called that because they look like little spikes. And in principle, this is the case with every virus, no matter what the name of the virus is. This is not medically correct, but let's imagine the virus as a ball, like a hedgehog ball that you get for children, and these spikes, these cones on the top of this ball, are the so-called surface proteins of a virus. They are specific to each virus, so each one has its own and they are called spikes because, when you look at them, they look a bit prickly. So, these spike proteins, which are viral proteins, are not human proteins. That's the first thing you always have to remember. Spike proteins are not human, they are foreign proteins. And when a virus like this enters our body, no matter what it's called, our immune system recognizes exactly that, namely these surface proteins, these spikes. Does not see the virus as a ball, as a virus, but I explain it to patients over and over again. I have a car and the spike protein is, so to speak, the wing mirror. It just has lots of wing mirrors and our immune system does not recognize the car, but the wing mirror. So now, when a virus enters the body, logically, lots of these spike proteins enter the body and viruses multiply. Yes, so viruses multiply in the body by invading a cell, reprogramming the cell and the cell builds new viruses. Logically, this also means new spike proteins, so it is not the proteins themselves that multiply, but they are multiplied by the viral activity. Quite trivial. This is the natural process and logically our immune system reacts primarily to these spike proteins. The spike protein recognizes them, works against them and therefore also against the virus. Does it only work when the spike protein has actually changed the cell or before? Well, originally only then, but when the immune system knows how to do it, of course, when it sees it outside, then it can start doing it. Although that's not so easy. That's why it's strongest when it's inside. So, that's the original story. That's what happens. It always happens, but that's just how it happens. A virus gets into the body. As I said, no matter what it's called, it infects the body, multiplies for a while, is fought off, and then it's gone. And then, logically, the biogenic protein is no longer there, or rather, no new one is added, because the virus is gone. So, like with the flu, so to speak, some people are bedridden with the flu for 4 days. During that time, the virus is in the body, it causes damage, but the immune system needs a certain amount of time to fight it off. Then it's reduced to a minimum, so to speak, and we feel better again. Everything is fine and these proteins can then be disposed of. So, now in the case of someone, if the virus naturally remains there a little longer or remains chronic because the immune system does not catch it, then of course these spike proteins logically remain in the body for longer and that is the case with post-COVID, long COVID or similar. And there too, it is not the proteins, it is simply because the virus has been there for longer. So, now that they are also there, the spike proteins only multiply when the virus divides. They do not simply multiply. The problem now is, if you have undergone this protective measure with these injections, the principle of the initial idea was not wrong. It was simply unfortunately done incorrectly. The idea was to inject a kind of blueprint into the body, like a Lego instruction leaflet, which tells you how to build a spike protein. That means, this injection injected a blueprint into the body and when a cell saw it, it saw, this is what I have to do and then simply started building these spike proteins. Not a completely wrong approach per se, because okay, I'm building spike proteins now and if there had only been 5,000 of them, then they're there. Our immune system starts working with them, recognizes them, starts to orient itself to them, destroys them and that wouldn't have been so bad. And now comes the really big problem and that's something that unfortunately hasn't been processed yet, let alone further researched, even though the data situation is unclear and so on and so forth. Or even worse, with the new mRNA 2.0 technology, things will get even more dramatic. The problem was that this blueprint that was injected didn't stop. It wasn't like there was just 5,000 spike proteins being built and I was working with them, but uncontrolled quantities, millions, billions of these foreign proteins, non-human virus proteins, uncontrolled. And here the emphasis is on uncontrollable. No idea, nobody knows how that's supposed to work, and that's what was said from the beginning. Guys, you have an idea. After 5,000 it stops. Can you explain to us how you're going to make it stop? It didn't exactly happen. An incredible amount was produced. But then at some point it stopped because the blueprint was read and done. But then we found that there were people who only produced maybe 10,000. Those were the ones who didn't notice anything. Usually they didn't have any protection either, but nothing happened. It's stupid if you produce 1 million of them. That was 10 times as much as with a viral infection, and then these proteins overwhelmed the body and unfortunately caused the problem, because of course they got to places where they shouldn't go, because there weren't 5,000, but 10 million. They got everywhere, and of course unfortunately also to the immune system, and in the immune system and to the cells of the immune system and to the founding cells, where new immune cells are now being built. These stupid proteins were everywhere, and now comes another major disadvantage. There was no further research because nobody was interested in it and because it is not a problem. Still, according to general statements, there is no sequential, proper, classical scientific research at universities. One might assume that people would rather not know at all, because then they would have to continue to ask unpleasant questions. But from an official perspective, there is no research. There are also other entrepreneurs or companies or people who are affected, who are doing research, so to speak, and then new truths come to light, such as the things we can talk about today, or even possible solutions, because from an official perspective, there are actually no possible solutions, because this problem does not actually exist. So it has basically been pushed into the corner a bit. Yes, exactly. That is exactly the core of it. So there is no official research, because it is not necessary. There is no problem at all. If I do not do this research, I have no traffic. There are other researchers, of course, individual research, small groups, unfortunately, are not funded by the state. You do not have incredible research funding for an incredible amount of things. It is all very individual interests, but really great things. Very welcome people who show great commitment to doing research. And there we saw that these spike proteins unfortunately play a very, very central role, namely severely weakening the innate immune system. And then there's something called autophagy. These are specific phagocytes. We have two parts of the immune system, the innate and the acquired. The innate has been around for billions of years. They're the first line of defense. They're the fighters, the cells that do something directly. The acquired immune system comes later. These are the antibodies, if you look at it in a very militaristic way. One is the infantry, the other is the snipers, the target shooters. The infantry is the one that does the work first. It confronts the virus and eliminates it all through phagocytes or autophagy, which also eats up debris, dead tissue, old mitochondrium, old tissue, and replaces it with new tissue. Autophagy is a very important part of the human organism. And this part of the immune system is severely impaired in its function by such scavenging proteins, and that then leads to problems with the immune system as a secondary consequence. And unfortunately, as we are currently seeing, it is very clear, although this was to be expected, also in the defense against cancer, which represents precisely these very bad developments with what is unscientifically called turbo cancer. But unfortunately, this is also the case with very aggressive cancers. So that is pure defense, but unfortunately also the autoimmunity, the normal process, which has nothing to do with a foreigner, but rather maintains my body in its function, because this is all a functional level of this innate immune system. And this is very severely damaged. There is a lot of scientific documentation on this. Unfortunately, not from these large-scale government research projects, but well-written and very well-published peer-reviewed publications, i.e. reviewed by other research groups on these topics, what all happens there, and that happens primarily due to this uncontrolled, huge number, and in the end it simply has something to do with the dose. If I somehow give you an injection of B12, then I know exactly that there is a dose of 100 micrograms of B12 in it. Period. Not 105, not even 150, but 100. It is also clearly stated on the packaging. I inject it, then you have exactly this amount in your body. With this injection procedure, there was no dosage information on the thing. In the end, there were no instructions for use. There was nothing. It was simply that you received a delivery of these injection things with a number on the pull, which you had to inject, and then the patient was protected. There was nothing written about it, because there was no dosage in it. There was only this blueprint in it, so you didn't know anything about the dosage. How much spike protein? That means you know because certain doses were also given to you, or probably as a doctor. Whether you have the reason for it or not. Yes, exactly. And so you don't know what happened. Nobody knows what dose he injected. Some colleagues even asked the health authorities about this afterwards. Tell me, can you tell us anything about a dose? And funnily enough, these questions are never answered. What dose was it? And now this uncontrollable thing is actually the problem, because we don't know at all. Millions, billions of these strange proteins were formed, and they get stuck at different levels. Exactly, the immune system obviously in the vessels, because we now know that it can cause small thromboses, i.e. clotting phenomena in the heart, this inflammation of the heart muscle, because these proteins apparently get stuck in the muscles in the heart. The immune system then docks onto these proteins and causes inflammation. Unfortunately, they get stuck in the heart, which causes inflammation of the heart. So these are kind of secondary cascades that were caused by these proteins. Especially because we couldn't control the numbers. And just so we don't forget to say that, unfortunately we have to formulate it seriously, because again nothing is being said. This new technology, mRNA 2.0, now has another approach with the argument that it works better. You don't have to focus so much on. The background is that this blueprint that you're now injecting, with the first model blueprint, after a few days the blueprint was gone, and then no new proteins were formed. Up until then it was uncontrolled, but at some point it was finished. That's why you had to boost it again after 1 or 2 months and after 3 months. Which I now see as a good thing. So I actually understand now that it's good, right? Because then it stops at some point. Exactly. And now with the new technology, which is called self-replicating mRNA. That means, you've summed it up perfectly. Exactly. And now comes the difficulty, that there can be situations, could be, are, maybe will be, where these proteins also enter the body via other routes, partly inhaled via normal routes, as you already said, or you had inhaled 3 coronaviruses for example and had the infection that you didn't even feel, or something like that. So, that's not an issue at all. The problem is, and now we come to this kind of chat thing or something like that. What happens if these spike proteins that are in a person, via whatever route sexual contact is one way, blood transfusion is something that is currently being discussed a lot, if these spike proteins now get back into my body in large numbers? Maybe I have a perfect immune system, nothing happens at all. Exactly. But if I have something, weakened things, my immune system is weakened, a lot of stress, or also, it is often forgotten, one of the strongest disruptive factors of the immune system is fear. It is very strongly immune reactive, negative, and now these proteins enter the body via a different route. Then, in the end, exactly the same thing can happen without it having happened through an injection or through an illness. And this phenomenon is hidden under the term shatting. Again, the same problem as before. It does not exist in the official language. Therefore, there is no official, state-funded, institutionalized university research with, results and possible consequences. But there are things that have now been investigated by many others, because there have been clearly demonstrable cases in terms of experiences. Someone has come into contact with someone, partly through sexual contact, partly apparently also through very close living together in the family, where there are obviously possibilities that these proteins can also be exchanged or passed on via the respiratory tract, 6 bodily fluids or whatever. There are certain reports, at least on the internet, from completely reliable sources, that one of the manufacturers has also discussed this transmission in internal reports. So it seems to be a potential issue that the manufacturers are aware of. What we know today is that it looks like this is also clear, it has a lot of it. If you have 200 of these spike proteins in your body, the probability that you will pass one on to me is very low and then nothing will actually happen. If you are one of those who wanted to protect yourself, have had your 4th vaccination and then have 1 billion of these proteins in your body, and we will see each other now and of course not talk in a video, but live in your living room. 1 billion spike proteins is a different phenomenon when you exhale something than when you only have 20 in you. So it obviously has something to do with the amount that is present in an organism at that moment. And it is particularly bad if you have had this booster shot, where incredible amounts of these proteins have been achieved, which are then possibly released via various routes. That's why it's not like everyone just does it like that, but as always, everything is a question of dosage, distance, so shaking hands is not an issue at all, but getting closer or exchanging information in other ways is an issue. And one of the big questions, at least many of the questions that patients ask me, is what about blood transfusions? So, if I go to donate blood as a person, which is in itself very advisable, since we need it for emergency patients, but I had a booster 3 days before and now have an incredible amount of these proteins in my blood, I donate it because I'm allowed to. No one asks because it's not an issue. Now the blood goes into the blood donation, is then preserved there and then given to a sick person. Now the problem arises. The person who receives the blood donation is not a healthy person, but someone who is already critically ill. That means their condition is not exactly good and they might now have this, and how do you deal with it? That's a question that I think is the right one to ask, and the authorities' answer is, oh, what the heck, it's all nonsense. Interesting question. Let's take a quick look at it and do some research, because it could be interesting. I think the right reaction would be to say, oh yes, okay, that's right, let's check it out, collect correct data, and determine that it's not a problem at all. Everyone is reassured, or vice versa. We determine that there could be a problem. What do we do now? But nothing happens. The answer to this correct scientific question to the authorities, what could happen, is all nonsense. That's not scientific, but a question that is posed scientifically should actually be answered scientifically and not rushed through. That's why we have to be honest and say that we are speculating, and we don't want to spread unnecessary fears. But we have to be honest and say that we can't say with certainty that it's not a problem. So what happens? I'll transfer them. And all these paths, those are precisely these paths. What about air? Does it obviously work if you get a little closer, if you sleep in the same bed or something? Kissing, sexual contact. Of course, shaking hands doesn't seem to be an issue at all, from what we've guessed so far. But there are obviously certain ways in which that could potentially happen. And then there's the same problem of dose and condition. As always, it's not the pathogen that's the problem, but the environment. Now it's not a direct pathogen, but a protein. But in the end it doesn't matter. What environment does it affect? In a great environment, then less happens, or in a severely weakened environment, then it's bad. And yes, even with a viral disease, it wasn't primarily the young, healthy people who were affected, but the seriously ill, who were also severely affected by the disease. That makes sense somehow.
Yes, you say, this new mRNA 2.0 story.
If they reproduce themselves, this blueprint that you spoke about, in which injections is this new technology used against what? At the moment, it's primarily the new COVID vaccination for the new season plus. This miraculous technology has now been set as the standard because it's so great, and now the first idea for the coming fall, so September, October, is the combination of corona and flu. So one injection for 2 diseases with the new technology, which makes it even better, of course, then I only need 1 injection and I'm protected against everything, if that's the case. And the real problem is that we haven't really progressed that far yet. All of these vaccines, or more precisely the technology behind the vaccine production, have now been approved as standard procedure without further discussion. So, they have been ratified as a proven, scientifically unproblematic standard procedure, so that there has been a testing period of perhaps a year or, for how long? No testing at all. You don't have to do any more tests. You just have to do the usual tests to make sure that the thing isn't toxic, that's clear. But you don't have to do any more safety tests, no long-term studies, no accompanying studies or anything like that. Instead, the method has proven itself, it works, and it can simply be copied. And the advantage, you have to see it, the advantage of this method for companies is that it's super easy to do. I now have the thing, and whether I create this blueprint for the flu, for corona, for tetanus, I can very easily program this blueprint in the computer, then it's installed in the syringe and that's it. So I can expand this vaccination to many different pathogens extremely quickly. I can simply rebuild it. That's very, very simple, which would be nice from the basic idea. We could react very quickly to something new. But that doesn't change the basic problem that we've discussed a few times now. But the nasty thing about it is that now it's like this. Everything is fine. The system doesn't have to be reviewed in depth again, which is why these vaccines can now be developed much faster and simply brought to market. Okay. So we're not talking about all vaccinations being converted yet, but they will probably be.
Okay, away from the more or less inactivated vaccine, which was already controversial at the time, to this completely new technology, and that applies to the whole of Europe. Did I understand that correctly? In the end, it's approved in Europe. And America has
been a small enclave for a long time, or at least at the moment, but the Swiss government has decided to ratify everything Europe does, which then subjects us to European doctrines, which has caused a bit of unrest in our country at the moment. Here, however, only among a relatively small part of the population. So, it can be assumed that Switzerland will not be part of the EU, but will be integrated into this healthcare system as a neutral country by adopting the international health regulations of the WHO and ratifying the EU. And that means it will be the same for us. Do you know where there are countries where this is not permitted or which are not participating in such a type of ratification? Yes, there are still a few individuals who treated themselves somewhat exclusively back then. Parts of Africa, parts of South America, individual small countries are still somewhat left out or which have now withdrawn from the WHO.
Okay. There could be a big lesson to be learned from what is currently happening in the USA. Let's see what the next step is. Kennedy has changed a lot in the FDA there.
Okay, then, dear Simon, I would like to tap into your practical experience a little bit. You are now dealing with people many years after the pandemic. Yes. What are the most common problems that you can attribute to what we've discussed so far? And maybe you already have a tip or two for solutions. Ultimately, of course, the patients come to the practice, we don't call them, they all report themselves. So it's not like we actively collect patients, but an incredible number of them are reporting more and more. And 3 central problems actually emerge. Point 1. Fatigue or whatever you want to call it, i.e. extreme exhaustion, sometimes people who are only able to lie in bed, who can only be transported in a wheelchair due to sheer physical weakness. This is certainly the most common group, this whole thing that runs. At some point it can of course be confused with the already known chronic fatigue syndrome, but it's incredible exhaustion, tiredness, lack of energy. That's the first and most central point. And the other 2 things I mentioned at the end are directly related to the immune system, namely oncology and autoimmune diseases. We are seeing an increasing number of cancer cases, on the one hand new, but above all previously stable and now spreading explosively. So pre-existing conditions due to treatment or whatever, in an essentially stable state, and now boom. And thirdly, there are really increasing numbers of autoimmune diseases, even in young people. Just last week, someone came to the practice who, after the second injection, had always been a completely healthy person, but after the second injection a week later, paralysis began and he now has an incomplete movement disorder of the entire lower extremities, i.e. still possible with residual movement. Conventional medicine cannot find an explainable cause in the sense of a blood disorder or whatever. It explains it as bad luck, i.e. as a coincidence, and the connection to the previous injection is negated, although very impressive and fits the system, because there are other such cases. So these are things where the immune system is triggered in such a way that it now recognizes the body's own tissue as foreign and fights against the body. This is an autoimmune disease. It affects the hair, alopecia, it affects the nervous system, up to MS, it affects the joints, it affects the intestines, then it is a kind of chronic intestinal inflammation. So, it can affect everything and can range in severity from very mild to very bad. And these are the three major groups, i.e. fatigue, oncology, autoimmune disease. When you have something like this, you naturally try to find causes. Of course, there are other causes for it. You always have to make it clear. A differential diagnosis is always made here. What else is there? Heavy metals and things like that. And then comes the next point. What do we do now? How do we prove it? And then it's about the question of measuring the spike proteins. Measuring them does not yet prove that they have done it. Of course not, but at least there is a higher probability. If the patient has symptoms and no spike proteins at all, then it couldn't have been spike proteins. If there are, and there are an incredible number of them, then there seems to be a higher probability. So the detection of spike proteins is not proof of the connection, but at least makes it more likely. And today, people are trying to measure these spike proteins using various methods. So you don't just try it, you measure it. There are various types of techniques that are used. And once this has been proven, it is logical that one of the experiments, or the test group after that, can somehow intelligently remove these spike proteins from the body, because if they are a contributing factor or a central cause, depending on the case of a disease process, but if I remove them, then there would at least be a chance that I can normalize things again. That's the idea behind it. So, that's kind of the way it works. Diagnostics or blood tests, that's clear. A lot is happening in that area at the moment. On the one hand, let's start with this. There is no governmental laboratory diagnostic research. In other words, these are individual companies or individual laboratories that have dealt very intensively with the topic. We are talking about a lot of immunology here. You have to indirectly check these spike proteins with other antibodies, because it is not as easy to measure as vitamin D. I simply take a blood sample, measure it, and then I look at it, because these spike proteins can circulate freely in the body. However, this is usually only the case with acute production, whether it is an illness or an injection. Okay, now with 2.0 it will be chronic production, but so far production has stopped at some point. Then there shouldn't be so many free proteins in the blood anymore, but they are already stuck somewhere, and that's where I have to look for them, logically, not in the free blood. And in this case they are called spike proteins in exosomes. Exo is outside the cell. Omens are kind of spheres. They are cell components and the spike proteins are trapped inside them, but unfortunately not trapped as neutral, but rather stored. That's where they are. So I don't have to look outside this sphere, but rather check whether the spike proteins are in this sphere in this exosome. This is what is considered one of the standard tests today. Spike proteins in exosomes. And right now, a lot is happening. 2 top-class new laboratories have been founded. They are of course small companies that use other immunological methods that are also used in normal medicine, with antibodies against spike proteins, where you can stain them and then the light shines where the things are and so on. So high-tech laboratory medicine, with which you can now search for these spike proteins in different cell compartments or in tissue structures. Or of course you can also get to them, but it's difficult. I would have to do a heart biopsy. I don't do that because that's not possible in real life in the heart. Looking in the heart muscle, that's where they are when I have an inflammation, and today that's done with indirect laboratory diagnostics. So it's high-tech medicine, but we're slowly learning more and more about where all these proteins could possibly be. That's the first step, and then the question is, how do we deal with them therapeutically?
Yes, of course I'd like to pick up on that a little bit. You also said that oncology is a big topic. You also called it turbo cancer. It doesn't surprise me, because if the body's own autophagy, i.e. the self-healing process of spike, is also interrupted or at least more or less damaged, then p53, which is considered a tumor suppressor, will probably also go. So, TP53 goes, so to speak, when the cell signals, I'm dead, more or less, or I'm mowing right now. Then the cell is eliminated. And if p53 goes, then it can't work at all because the spike protein is blocked. Then these cells multiply uncontrollably, and that leads to cancer, and very quickly, right?
Yes, precisely because there is no intervention. So how would the immune system have said, "Hey, that's it, I'm going to finish it off"? The fight against cancer or something similar is like this. A cell mutates or begins to mutate and the immune system destroys this cell. That would be the process you just described, which is one of the most important defense mechanisms, and that's where the innate immune system comes into play, not the high-tech machinery with the antibodies.
And if this central defense unit is damaged, it's no longer a trivial matter, but has very far-reaching potential consequences. Yes.
And that's exactly it. And you also mentioned that the body then attacks itself at some point. So far, we only know this from Hashimoto's, for example. And then there are voices that say, yes, the body never attacks itself, it is intelligent and so on. Yes, it is, but if it is hijacked in this way, then it no longer knows how to differentiate between good and bad, more or less likely, right? So it tries to do its best. It would never attack itself, but it thinks, the enemy is the friend or vice versa. Yes, I mean, of course the body is never intelligent, as we understand it by intelligence, but you can still say that as an image. Of course, logically, our body is not stupid and attacks itself, but now again, to put it very simply, we would compare it. Even a highly intelligent person who has completed 5 university courses and has an IQ of 150. If I teach them something new and say, hey, that's all true, but look, here we have completely new information. A study has shown that the Earth is flat. Even a highly intelligent person can potentially make a mistake. Intelligence does not protect against mistakes. That means that a normal body does not attack itself, which is logical. But why on earth should it not be able to make a mistake? Every system can make mistakes, and through such measures, heavy metals do that too. Our defense soldiers can be forced into making mistakes, and then unfortunately it does happen. A healthy body would not attack itself, but if someone has a mistake, it does. That's exactly what it is. Let's come back to certain solutions at the end. You have already mentioned that diagnostics are of course at the forefront in order to understand what is actually present in the body, and there are already a number of companies that are researching this, and then there are now many different measures that are being taken by some experts. From simple things like lion's axe extraction to really drastic measures like blood dialysis. What are your experiences? Is it a combination of everything? Is it your individual? A little bit. In the end, you have to be completely honest about that, because unfortunately I have to criticize the scene a little bit. There are sometimes very absolutist statements here, like you just have to do this and that all bikes are gone, without any scientific basis. That has to be said clearly, that someone would have to claim that they have a method, 3 things that you take, that have been proven to make the spike set, does not exist, because for that you would have to do this. I measure it, I treat it, and then measure it again. And then it has to be according to a standardized system. I don't mean that to devalue the method, simply scientifically thought. I simply do a muscle test with you, I treat you, I do another muscle test, and then the muscle test is better. That doesn't prove that the spikes are really gone. So, you have to do that. If you measure, you have to measure. And so far, none of these methods exist. You always have to be honest about that. That's the first thing. Nevertheless, there is experience, and it seems that you can achieve certain things with certain things. However, even now it's still a big individual issue. That is, there are patients who respond quite well to something like that. Then there are patients where you do exactly the same thing and nothing happens. So there is no method that you can always use, but one that you can generally claim works for everyone, is non-existent. We have to be honest about that, but there are many interesting things. After all, there are proteins, and ultimately we want to get rid of the proteins. To do that, you have to bind them somehow, take them, ideally chop them up or something, and excrete them. That's kind of the idea behind all this, and plant extracts are certainly involved. Personally, I haven't really seen anything with dandelion. I have patients who have done it and seen 0 effects, which doesn't mean it doesn't work. I'm just saying that I don't have much experience with these enzymes, nattokinase and the like. In my opinion, that could also be part of the complex. Whether they really do remove all the spike proteins or at least reduce the damage caused by the spike proteins is a second question, but at least you can see that relatively well. There's a lot of discussion about mushrooms at the moment, about medicinal mushrooms, which could have various options. That could also be the case, because we know that medicinal mushrooms, which are these, most people are probably familiar with the rhe mushroom as an example, have very interesting immunological effects. This has been described, and yes, I think that when I look at the current scientific status, we are really talking about proteins that are attached to certain systems or in these exosomes, but are still there. Then personally, with the current knowledge and the little diagnostics that we can do, these measurements seem to me to be one of the most efficient methods. However, it doesn't work for everyone and it doesn't always work, and whether you really need 50 of these blood samples as some people describe, I don't believe that either. So you have to be careful. At some point the dollar sign may become more important than the patient's name. But from experience with patients who have undergone it, it seems that these toxophoresis and plasma tests can be a pretty intelligent approach. Not when I have a few complaints, but in cases of serious illnesses, where you can measure what's in the filter material, and that's where you start. The spike proteins in the eluate aren't measured enough yet. That would be what's filtered out. Are there spike proteins in there? That would be exciting. We're only just starting to do more with these new techniques. So we have to be completely honest, we don't currently know of any scientifically or even vaguely scientifically based approach with a bit of study experience, but we do know of a few interesting models, where I personally am a supporter of combinations. Enzymes, intestines, herbal mushrooms, and in severe cases, I have actually seen a few very good cases that improved substantially, especially in terms of fatigue, under this plasma-based therapy. But I have to be honest, I have also seen patients who improved significantly through energetic therapy, where other approaches have obviously been found to resolve these consequences of the proteins. But ultimately, in German, it is individual. At the moment, there is no such thing as a given pattern that everyone can simply do, but rather you delve into the system, look at the individual patient, whether they have more and more immunological disorders, more fatigue, or more of that, and then try to create a therapeutic setting based on this knowledge. Yes, I think the whole topic is, as always, as individual as the person is, and in this topic, we are mainly talking about the material realm. So, that means that we perceive our body as matter, right? And accordingly, if our body is not doing well, if something is not working, then we would also know how to fix it with matter. At the latest since Einstein or other clever minds, we have known that we cannot fix a problem on the same level on which it arose. We can perhaps somehow balance it out there, but if we look at the level above, you just mentioned energy. There seems to be solutions there, or at least support, to say, hey, I am now open to this working. However, I can very well imagine that during the pandemic and then afterwards, fear was played with extremely blatantly. That is to say, this fear of death seems to be so deeply entrenched in many patients that this energetic level cannot come into play at all, because the fear is so strong and suppresses everything. Whereas now someone who experiences a kind of spontaneous healing like in the past might simply say, hey, I'm Hans, look up into the air, it'll work out. Hey, I'm always positive, I'm exaggerating a bit now, is open to the fact that this will also have an influence on the treatment, right? Not only is it 100% agreed, but it's also a central topic that needs to be integrated without discussion and is even scientifically clear. One of them is called placebo. Too bad, I'm using my word. So, I work with you, we take a positive path together and say, hey, this is coming, this will work. That doesn't mean praising the sky, not giving up, but saying, hey, why shouldn't this work? Let's be open and be positive now and we'll make it and everything will be fine. By the way, placebo is not a fake treatment, but the power of positive moods. And nocebo is exactly the opposite. I harm through my words, through fear, through negativity. Yes, the next one, and now we are already threatened by the next wave of the virus, and it came 3 weeks ago, and funnily enough, a lot of people have actually gotten sick, or maybe not, maybe not. It was really terrible. There is a summer wave coming, so everyone had to get their masks out again immediately. It was madness in Switzerland. Luckily, nobody did that, but it was managed again with fears. So and that's why I actually think one of the most important points in all these things is to treat fears. So we have to get out of this spiral of negativity and into positive thinking. Things can turn out well, not into completely illusory thinking in the sense of, nothing will ever happen to me in my life. Okay, I'm fine with that, but it's not about irrational fears, but rather out of this spiral of fear, into a we help each other, let's see. So for me it's like, let's see if that doesn't work. The idea is actually to, instead of saying, oh no, it won't work anyway, and now the next virus is coming and I'll be dead, which is what people have been told. Yes, I think that's a nice closing statement, and as I said, you're not only welcome on my channel, but also on many other channels. QS24 makes a lot of videos with you and Schumann, and even though you're so incredibly busy, you still have your own website, where people can turn to if they actually want to discuss their topic with you for 15 or 30 minutes, and you then also offer individual solutions, right? So it's an incredible gift that you're still doing this. Of course, we need energy exchange in the form of money, but for some people, something like that might seem unaffordable. So, where can people execute themselves with you? It's actually on my homepage, which you kindly linked. You can see some information there, and there's not that much, because my time is also limited at some point, and I also have to look after myself and my family. But I have unlocked a few slots in my free time, except because unfortunately I practically don't have any more opportunities during my working hours. We are overrun with patients and don't know where to go anymore, and then that was the only chance I have left. But it is my free time, but I still like to do it in these settings, where you can simply get information for specific individual consultations and yes, it's amazing. I like to look at your calendar now and you actually almost exclusively have appointments in the evenings from 8:45 p.m. to 9:30 p.m., for example. It's incredible how committed you are. Others have long since been sitting on the sofa and have called it a day, and you are still helping people. So I really have my deepest respect and that you always take the time for these great videos here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, then I'll show you stay healthy, stay broccoli again today. Maybe it doesn't help directly with the whole issue that we addressed today, but if you believe that it is healthy for you, then it will be and maybe even taste good. So on that note, your Simon and your Christian say see you soon. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.